Have you ever had the uneasy sense that something about reality is being explained to you correctly, and yet it still feels wrong, like an important piece quietly disappeared along the way? For many people, this feeling shows up when they hear quantum physics discussed with absolute confidence. A podcast clip, a viral post, a sentence that sounds intelligent, comforting, even empowering. But instead of clarity, there's resistance, not because the idea is complex, but because it feels reduced, flattened, as if something fundamentally unsettling about reality has been smoothed over to make it easier to digest. You might not know what's missing, only that the explanation feels safer than the reality it claims to describe. That quantum consciousness is being framed as a belief, while a hidden reality, far stranger and far less convenient, is quietly ignored. The discomfort isn't academic, it's visceral. A sense that the conversation itself is avoiding something essential. And this is where the real tension begins. Because the biggest mistake people make when talking about quantum physics isn't getting the math wrong. It's removing the part that actually challenges how we think about observation, certainty, and our place in reality. Once you notice that omission, you start seeing it everywhere, and you realize there's something most explanations never let you sit with long enough to fully see. If this landed with a quiet sense of recognition, let that register without forcing it into words. Sometimes alignment shows up as a pause rather than a reaction, a subtle acknowledgement that you're hearing something you've sensed before. Staying here isn't about following a personality. It's about remaining in a shared space with others who are willing to question surface explanations instead of accepting them too quickly. If it feels right, leave a short comment that begins with, "I realized that," or "This made me notice." Not to explain, just to reflect what shifted. What comes next is grounded in direct observation, an experiment that forced physicists to confront what they thought reality was doing, long before it was ever simplified for easy conversation. In 1972, physicist John Clauser at the University of California, Berkeley carried out one of the first experimental tests of John Bell's inequalities, a test designed to check whether reality behaves the way common sense says it should. The assumption was simple. Objects have properties independent of observation, and influences travel locally, not instantaneously. Clauser's experiment, later refined and repeated worldwide, showed that this assumption fails. Entangled particles behaved as if they were part of a single system, responding to measurement instantly, regardless of distance. No signal passed between them in any classical sense. The result wasn't mysterious, it was deeply inconvenient. What unsettled physicists wasn't just non-locality, it was what measurement itself seemed to do. The observer effect wasn't about human awareness changing particles through belief. It was about interaction forcing a system to choose among possibilities that mathematically existed beforehand. The quantum field didn't present a finished picture until it was probed. Reality, at its most basic level, behaved less like a thing and more like a negotiation. And this means that you are living inside a world that isn't fully resolved until it's engaged with. Not symbolically, not spiritually, structurally. If you've ever felt that certain situations in your life remained strangely undefined until you were forced to decide, or that over-examining a moment seemed to collapse its openness into something rigid, that tension belongs here. It's not intuition playing tricks. It's the mind brushing against a rule of reality that feels wrong only because it contradicts what we were taught to expect. Many people sense this mismatch without language for it. A discomfort with explanations that insist everything is fixed, settled, already determined. Clauser's experiment doesn't turn that discomfort into a worldview, but it does place it inside a serious discussion about consciousness expansion and interaction with a responsive quantum field. And this is only the first fracture in the familiar story, because the next concept doesn't just challenge how reality behaves, it challenges how perception itself enters the equation. In the early 2000s, neuroscientists studying perception began focusing on a concept known as neural coherence, the degree to which different regions of the brain synchronize their activity when processing information. Research conducted at institutions like Stanford and MIT showed that when coherence increases, the brain integrates signals more efficiently, reducing internal noise and sharpening perception. This isn't about intelligence or belief, it's about timing. When signals align, the system becomes more sensitive to subtle changes in its environment. And this explains why certain moments register in your body before they make sense in your head. A sudden stillness, as if everything briefly quiets down. A light pressure or warmth that isn't emotional, just present. A clarity that arrives without effort, where attention feels wider and less strained. These sensations aren't messages. They're the nervous system detecting alignment, responding to patterns before conscious interpretation steps in. What's less commonly discussed is that coherence isn't stable. It fluctuates. When it drops, perception fragments. People report restlessness, vague unease, or the sense that something is slightly off without being able to say why. From a scientific standpoint, this isn't mysterious. It reflects how closely perception is tied to the body's internal state and its interaction with surrounding information. The observer effect in this context isn't limited to measurement devices. It extends to how the entire system processes reality through the quantum field it inhabits. Becoming aware of this changes how experiences are interpreted. It shifts attention away from forcing conclusions and toward noticing when perception feels aligned or strained. But that awareness carries weight, because once you recognize how sensitive your system really is, you also begin noticing how often it's pulled out of alignment, and that realization doesn't stay comfortable for long. At this point, the conversation stops feeling external. It starts turning inward, and that's usually where things get uncomfortable. Not because the ideas are dangerous, but because noticing them can quietly separate you from the ease of not noticing. There's a particular kind of solitude that comes with realizing you're paying attention in ways others aren't asking for. You may start second-guessing yourself, wondering if you're reading too much into things, or if it would be simpler to accept the explanations that make life feel lighter and less complicated. Many people experience this as a subtle dislocation. You're still part of the world, still functioning, still connected, but something feels slightly misaligned. Conversations skim the surface. Certainty feels borrowed rather than earned. There's an unspoken fear that seeing more might also mean fitting in less, that naming what you sense could cost comfort or belonging. It's not dramatic, and it's rarely shared out loud. It's carried quietly. This isn't an ego collapse or a crisis of identity. It's the moment where familiar frameworks stop holding everything together. That can feel like a fracture, because the version of reality you relied on no longer feels complete. If any of this resonates, there's nothing you need to do with it. No stance to take, no conclusion to reach. Simply recognizing this tension is enough for now. Because within that discomfort is also the beginning of a broader capacity, one that doesn't erase the difficulty, but changes what becomes possible once you're ready to see it clearly. What begins to settle now isn't an answer, but a reframing of everything you've just encountered. The experiments we touched on didn't point to a broken world or a special kind of person. They pointed to a reality that behaves less like a finished object and more like an active process, and to perception as something unevenly distributed within it. The observer effect challenged the idea that the world is fully formed before interaction. Research on coherence and neural timing showed that experience reaches the body before it reaches explanation. Together, they suggest that feeling out of sync isn't necessarily a flaw. It can be a form of sensitivity to how reality actually operates. When you feel different, displaced, or slightly misaligned, it may not mean you're failing to adapt. It may mean you're registering layers of information that don't show up in simplified explanations. Some people move through life buffered by certainty. Others feel the seams where things don't quite line up. Time feels uneven. Attention carries weight. Meaning doesn't arrive on demand. None of this makes one better or worse, but it does imply that awareness itself has depth, and that depth can feel uncomfortable when it isn't named. Seen through this lens, being out of place stops looking like a personal defect and starts looking like a mismatch between how reality behaves and how it's usually described. That insight doesn't resolve the tension, it sharpens it. Because if perception participates in shaping experience more than we assume, then the unsettling question isn't why reality feels strange at times. It's how much of it we've been trained to overlook. And once that question takes hold, it doesn't close neatly. It creates a quiet pressure to keep looking, to follow the implications further, knowing that what comes next will complicate the picture even more rather than simplify it. If there's a final recognition settling in, let it be this. Noticing what feels off in the way reality is explained doesn't make you cynical. It means you're unwilling to accept answers that feel complete but ring hollow. That kind of attention doesn't rush toward certainty. It stays with the tension long enough to learn from it. Continuing from here isn't about following content out of habit, but about choosing to remain in a space where questions are allowed to stay sharp instead of being softened for comfort. What comes next presses directly into that edge. In what quantum physics actually says, without the mysticism, the conversation strips away the stories that get repeated and looks carefully at what the science itself is, and is not, willing to claim, an examination that unsettles familiar narratives even further. Your consciousness brought you here. What happens now is your choice.